Nobody dared to speak of the old house on Valentine's Hill after dark, not in a way that made it sound like anything but a distant memory. It had stood for centuries, tall and imposing, its weathered wooden walls barely able to stand against the harsh winds that blew through the hills. It wasn't the kind of place one thought of fondly. Most people in town passed by with their heads down, eyes averted, as if they could feel the eyes of the past watching them, waiting for something. The house had a history, and so did the curse that lingered around it. It all began long ago, back when Valentine's Hill was more than just a name. Back when the hill was home to the Valentine family, known not for their love, but for their tragic misfortune. It was on a bitter February night many years ago that the curse was born. The story went like this. Charlotte Valentine was a young woman full of life and beauty, admired by everyone in the village. She had eyes that sparkled like the stars and a smile that could light up even the darkest corner. Charlotte was in love, or at least she thought she was. She was betrothed to a man named Edward, a soldier who had won her heart long before he left for war. They had exchanged countless letters, promises of love, and dreams of the future. She had never doubted that one day he would return to her. But the night of their engagement was different. It was February 14th, Valentine's Day, the night she had been waiting for, the night he had promised to come home. The air was thick with the scent of roses, the promise of a future, and the spark of hope. But as the evening wore on, there was no sign of him. The hours stretched endlessly. She waited in the parlor, pacing nervously, clutching the love letter he had sent her just days before. The candlelight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. But Edward never came. The villagers told her it was just the war, he'd be back soon, just a little late. They spoke in whispers, trying to comfort her. But Charlotte knew deep in her heart that something was wrong. She never saw him again. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. And still, no word came from Edward. It wasn't long before Charlotte's health began to deteriorate. The weight of her grief, the suffocating loss of her love, pressed heavily on her chest. She wandered the halls of the house, talking to the empty rooms, waiting for something that would never come. Eventually, her mind snapped. She became a ghost of herself, her eyes hollow with longing, her face pale and drawn. In the dead of winter, on another Valentine's Day, Charlotte Valentine died, her heart broken beyond repair. But that wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. It was said that her spirit never left the house. The village, once lively and full of celebration, became somber. People started to notice things, strange things. The once bustling market grew quiet, the air thick with fear. Those who dared to speak her name in the night reported hearing soft whispers, a woman's voice crying out in agony, asking for the one thing she could never have, her lost love. But worse than the whispers were the letters. Letters would arrive on every Valentine's Day, delivered to unsuspecting recipients. The letters were always the same, signed only with one name, Charlotte. They were short and to the point, written in an elegant, looping hand that gave a sense of timelessness. The contents were the same year after year. Find the lost love of my heart. The curse will haunt you if you fail. Some thought it a joke, a prank played by the children of the village. But when the letters started to arrive at the homes of those who had never known Charlotte, things began to change. Those who received the letters started to vanish. One by one, the young and old alike began to disappear, leaving only their belongings behind. The village, once full of life, began to empty. And it wasn't just the people. The house itself seemed to be alive, watching, waiting. The rooms would grow cold without explanation, the air thick with the smell of roses, the floorboards creaking under invisible feet. Even those who dared to enter the house found it unnervingly familiar, as if the walls themselves knew the name of the one who entered, and they were unwilling to let them leave. The curse had become a ritual, an unbreakable cycle. Each year, on Valentine's Day, the house called out to someone, a new victim, a new soul to carry the burden of Charlotte's lost love. They would receive the letter. And if they didn't follow the instructions, if they didn't find Edward's lost grave, the curse would haunt them, just as it had haunted the Valentine family for generations. This was the story told in whispers, passed from one fearful soul to the next. But one day, a curious soul by the name of Ethan Darrow, a journalist with a hunger for the truth, decided to delve deeper into the mystery. Ethan had heard the stories, of course, but he didn't believe in curses or ghosts. He had made a name for himself by investigating the supernatural and exposing the hoaxes behind them. But something about this case drew him in. The story of the lost Valentine's Day curse was too compelling to ignore. The village was running out of people, out of life. And if there was a chance, even a slight chance, that he could uncover the truth, he knew he had to try. The night he arrived at Valentine's Hill, the fog was thick, rolling across the hill like a living, breathing thing. The house loomed in the distance, its outline barely visible against the murky sky. Ethan's heartbeat quickened as he approached, the weight of the village's history pressing down on him. His flashlight flickered, and the wind howled through the trees. He knew the stories, knew that every person who had entered the house had vanished. But he wasn't afraid. Not yet. With a deep breath, Ethan stepped up to the front door, the cold iron of the doorknob biting into his palm. The door creaked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the night. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and something more, a floral sweetness, as though roses had bloomed long ago and never wilted. The house was eerily silent, every creak of the floorboards amplifying in the vast, empty space. He stepped further inside, the beam of his flashlight bouncing off the peeling wallpaper and dust-covered furniture. Then, as he turned the corner, he saw it. A single letter, placed neatly on the mantelpiece, addressed to him. The handwriting was unmistakable, delicate, elegant, looping in a way that seemed impossibly old. "Find my lost love. The curse will take you if you fail." The words on the page seemed to leap out at him, sending a cold chill through his spine. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a joke. The curse was real. And as the wind howled outside, he heard it, the faintest whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "Ethan! Find him, before it's too late!" The house seemed to close in on him, its walls pressing tighter, the air thick with unseen eyes. As the wind picked up, he turned toward the door, only to find it gone. The doorway was now a wall, sealing him inside. Ethan was trapped, just like every soul before him. And the curse? It was only just beginning. Ethan's heart raced as the walls of the house seemed to close in around him. The room was suffocating, filled with the thick scent of roses that lingered in the air like an uninvited guest. The whispering, faint but unmistakable, seemed to grow louder, filling his mind with words he couldn't fully comprehend. His pulse pounded in his ears as he spun around, searching for a way out, but the door had vanished. There was no escape. The house had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many before. The wind outside howled through the windows, a low, mournful sound that reverberated through the structure. Ethan pressed his hand against the cold walls, his mind racing. The letter. The curse. Everything about this place felt wrong, as if it had been waiting for him all along. His flashlight flickered, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to dance and twist as if alive. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, a chill that cut through him like a knife. He wrapped his arms around himself, trying to stave off the growing dread that gnawed at his insides. The shadows on the walls seemed to whisper, their voices like a chorus of sorrowful souls calling from beyond the veil. Suddenly, the air grew still. The faint whispers stopped. And in that silence, a new sound emerged. Soft, delicate footsteps, echoing through the dark house. They came from the hallway behind him. Ethan spun around, his flashlight beam trembling as it swept across the empty corridor. The footsteps stopped. Then he saw it. A figure, barely visible in the dim light, standing in the doorway at the end of the hall. The shape was draped in shadows, its features obscured by the darkness, but Ethan could feel its presence. It was like the room itself had taken on a life of its own. Who are you?" Ethan's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper as his body trembled. He took a tentative step forward, his flashlight trained on the figure. The figure didn't move. "Are you the one who's been leaving the letters?" Ethan demanded, his heart racing in his chest. His eyes never left the figure. Something in the pit of his stomach told him he was no longer alone in this place. Something ancient, something dangerous, was watching him. The figure slowly lifted its hand, a long, thin finger pointing directly at Ethan. And then the whisper returned, louder now, as if the entire house was speaking to him at once. "Find him, find Edward, before the curse claims you too." Ethan's blood ran cold. The figure spoke of Edward. The man Charlotte had loved. The man whose grave he needed to find. Before he could react, the figure seemed to dissipate, fading into the shadows like smoke, leaving nothing but a faint trace of cold air. The footsteps, the whisper, everything vanished as quickly as it had come. But the air was still thick with unease. The house seemed to breathe, its old timbers creaking and groaning as though it were alive, watching. Ethan's breath quickened, his skin tingling with an energy he couldn't explain. He knew what he had to do. He had to find Edward's grave. It was the only way to break the curse, the only way to escape the house that had trapped him in its grip. But how? The house was vast, full of dark corners and hidden rooms. It felt like it was shifting around him, its walls constantly moving, changing, hiding its secrets. His eyes flickered toward the window, but the fog outside had grown thick, pressing against the glass, blurring his view of the world beyond. He had no idea how much time had passed since he entered the house, but it didn't matter. He couldn't leave without finding the truth. Without finding Edward. The whispers had given him a clue. Edward's grave. But where? He felt the pull again, stronger this time. The call of the house, as if it was guiding him, urging him to go deeper, to find the truth that had been buried for so long. The room in front of him seemed to open up, the shadows parting just enough to reveal a narrow staircase that led down into the dark, toward the basement. With no other choice, Ethan moved forward, his breath shallow as he descended into the unknown. The staircase creaked under his weight, the steps sounding like echoes of forgotten footsteps that had gone before him. The air grew colder as he descended, the walls lined with ancient stone that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. At the bottom of the stairs, the darkness was absolute. Ethan could barely see his own hand in front of his face. But then, something caught his eye, something faintly glowing in the dark. A shape. A door. He moved toward it, his heart pounding, his legs trembling with each step. The door opened with a groan, revealing a small chamber beyond. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and the remnants of forgotten years. But there, in the center of the room, was something that made Ethan freeze in his tracks. A grave. The stone slab was old, worn by time, but still legible. The name carved into it was unmistakable, Edward Valentine. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he stepped forward, his hands trembling. This was it. This was the place. As his fingers brushed against the cold stone, the room seemed to shift. The walls creaked, and the ground trembled beneath his feet. For a moment, Ethan thought the house was going to collapse around him. But then, the air grew still once more. He knelt before the grave, his hand resting on the stone, his eyes searching the inscription. But as he read the words, something strange happened. A soft glow began to emanate from the grave, filling the room with a faint, ethereal light. It was as though the grave itself was alive, and the house had been waiting for this moment. And then the voice came again, the voice of Charlotte. "You found him," it whispered, this time not in the shadows, but right beside him. The voice was softer now, but full of sorrow. "Now you must make the choice." Ethan stood up slowly, his head spinning. The glow from the grave intensified, and for a brief moment, he could see the figure of Charlotte Valentine standing in the corner of the room, her eyes full of grief. She was real, too real, like a specter pulled from the past. "Charlotte," Ethan whispered, his voice shaking. "What do I do? What is this? Why am I here?" Charlotte's figure moved closer, her face full of regret. "You've opened the door, Ethan. And now the curse will follow you. You must choose, will you return what was taken, or will you remain here with us forever?" The light around the grave grew blinding, Ethan could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on him, the shadows of the past wrapping around him like a vice. The choice was his. But as the light enveloped him, he realized that some choices, some decisions, were too much to bear. The grave's glow dimmed as the house grew silent. The curse had not been broken, and the mystery remained.